The annual summer fete at Ashwood had always been the village's crowning glory, and this particular Saturday morning promised to be no exception. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Mrs. Clement at the vicarage, found herself positioned at a small table beneath the ancient elm, her knitting bag resting primly beside a cup of rapidly cooling tea. From this vantage point, she could observe the familiar choreography of village life unfolding across the green. The morning sun cast gentle shadows as residents bustled about their preparations. Mrs. Dorothy Whitfield, the vicar's wife, moved between the stalls with characteristic efficiency, her clipboard clutched like a shield against chaos. Lady Honoria Ashwood, imperious in her bath chair, directed operations from beneath a striped marquee, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Dr. Marcus Finch, recently arrived from London to take over the village practice, assisted Miss Eleanor Vance with the bookstall, their easy laughter carrying across the green in a way that made several matrons exchange meaningful glances. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she observed these small dramas. She noted how Mr. Geoffrey Blackwood, the estate agent who had returned to claim his inheritance after 20 years abroad, stood apart from the festivities, his expensive walking stick tapping an impatient rhythm against the cobblestones. The villagers' polite nods in his direction carried an unmistakable chill. "Such a lovely turnout," murmured Mrs. Clement, settling beside her guest with a satisfied sigh. "Though I do hope there won't be any unpleasantness. Geoffrey's return has stirred up rather uncomfortable memories." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed Mrs. Clement's gaze to where Blackwood stood examining the ancient stocks with apparent amusement. "Old grievances have a way of festering in small communities," she observed mildly, "like wounds that never quite heal properly." The morning progressed with the gentle rhythm of rural tradition. Children darted between the stalls, clutching sticky treats, while their elders sampled Mrs. Hartwell's famous preserves and debated the merits of competing flower arrangements. The brass band from the neighboring village had set up near the war memorial, their instruments gleaming in the strengthening Sunday. It was precisely at 11 o'clock, as the church bell chimed the hour, that the tranquil scene shattered like fine china dropped on stone. The scream came from the direction of the chapel, where Lady Ashwood had been overseeing the arrangement of flowers for the afternoon service. Her voice, normally so commanding, rose in a pitch of pure terror that silenced even the chattering children. "Murder!" she cried, her walking frame abandoned as she stumbled backward from the chapel's side entrance. "Dear God, there's been murder!" The crowd surged toward the ancient building like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Miss Marple rose more slowly, her keen gaze taking in the details others missed. The way Dr. Finch's face had gone ashen, how Eleanor Vance's hand flew instinctively to her throat, the manner in which Geoffrey Blackwood's knuckles whitened around his walking stick. Inside the chapel's dim vestry, they found him. Mr. Arthur Pendleton, the village solicitor, lay crumpled beside the altar, his usually immaculate appearance grotesquely disheveled. A heavy brass candlestick, dark with what was unmistakably blood, rested nearby on the flagstones. His briefcase had been rifled through, papers scattered like autumn leaves across the ancient stones. But it was the expression frozen on the dead man's face that Miss Marple found most telling, not surprise or fear, but recognition. Arthur Pendleton had known his killer. As the constable was summoned and the crowd pressed forward with morbid curiosity, Miss Marple remained at the threshold, her experienced eyes cataloguing every detail. In her long acquaintance with human nature, she had learned that murder was rarely sudden. It grew slowly, like poison ivy, from seeds planted long ago. The peaceful village of Ashwood had just revealed its first deadly secret. Within moments, Constable Peters arrived at a breathless run, his usually cheerful countenance now grave with responsibility. He positioned himself at the vestry entrance, attempting to maintain some semblance of order as the crowd pressed forward with morbid curiosity. "Doctor," Finch was already kneeling beside Arthur Pendleton's still form, his experienced fingers checking for signs of life that everyone knew would not be found. "He's been dead perhaps 10 minutes, the doctor announced quietly, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of his profession. The blow was delivered with considerable force, but there are no defensive wounds. He knew his attacker. Lady Ashwood, having recovered her characteristic composure with remarkable speed, had positioned herself on a nearby pew. "I found him when I came to arrange the altar flowers," she declared with authority. "The side door was standing ajar, which struck me as odd. Arthur was always most particular about security." Miss Marple remained near the threshold, her pale blue eyes taking in details that others might overlook. She noticed how Geoffrey Blackwood gripped his walking stick with white knuckles, how Eleanor Vance instinctively moved closer to Dr. Finch's reassuring presence, and how Mrs. Whitfield's efficient manner masked a tremor in her hands. "What business could have brought Arthur here so early on a Saturday?" "Mrs." Clement whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of speculation. "Chapel business, most likely," replied Mrs. Whitfield, though her tone suggested uncertainty. He'd been asking rather pointed questions about the trust documents lately, something concerning property rights and old deeds. Geoffrey Blackwood's head snapped up at these words. "Property rights? What sort of questions?" Before anyone could elaborate, the sound of motor cars announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock from county headquarters. The inspector, a methodical man with tired eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker aspects, quickly took charge of the scene, as the crowd reluctantly dispersed to await questioning. Miss Marple found herself observing the subtle shifts in behavior that murder invariably produced. The festive atmosphere had curdled into something far more complex, a mixture of shock, fear, and barely concealed calculation. She noticed Arthur's scattered papers bore recent dates, and his briefcase had been thoroughly searched. Someone had been looking for something specific. Her sharp eyes caught the faint waxy residue on the dead man's index finger and a few white granules near the altar steps, like coarse salt or perhaps sugar. "Poor Arthur," murmured Mrs. Hartwell, clutching her husband's arm. "Who could have done such a terrible thing? He was such a harmless man." "Harmless?" Geoffrey Blackwood's voice carried an edge of bitter amusement. "Arthur Pendleton knew everyone's business in this village. In my experience, that's rarely what one would call harmless." The comment sent a ripple of unease through the gathering. Miss Marple reflected that in small communities, secrets had a way of festering like untreated wounds. Arthur Pendleton, as the village solicitor, would indeed have been privy to many confidential matters: wills, property disputes, family scandals carefully buried beneath layers of respectability. Finch shot Blackwood a disapproving look. "That's rather uncharitable, considering the circumstances. Truth doesn't become less true simply because someone dies," Blackwood replied coolly. As Inspector Craddock began his preliminary examination, Miss Marple noted the timing with particular interest. The church bell had struck 11 just as Lady Ashwood discovered the body, but Arthur had arrived much earlier, around 9:30, according to Tom Hartwell. Someone had arranged to meet him privately, someone he trusted enough to turn his back on. The killer had been methodical yet hurried, searching through documents but abandoning the murder weapon. Most tellingly, they had known Arthur would be at the chapel that morning during the fete, when the village's attention would be elsewhere. This was no crime of sudden passion, Miss Marple concluded, but something far more calculated and dangerous. Inspector Craddock's methodical approach to questioning began immediately, transforming the chapel's north aisle into a makeshift interview area. Miss Marple positioned herself on a nearby bench, her knitting providing the perfect cover for observation as each villager was called forward in turn. The inspector's questions were thorough but routine, following the standard pattern she had witnessed in countless investigations over the years. Lady Ashwood, summoned first, maintained her characteristic composure despite the morning's shock. "I arrived at the chapel at 10:45 to arrange the altar flowers," she stated with precision. "The side door stood ajar, which struck me as unusual. Arthur was always meticulous about security. I found him collapsed beside the altar, with a candlestick nearby. Her account was delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed, without question, yet Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation when Lady Ashwood mentioned the timing and how her fingers worried at the chain of keys hanging from her waist. Mrs. Whitfield followed, her usual efficiency somewhat strained. "Arthur took the sacristy keys yesterday afternoon," she explained, her voice carrying an undertone of defensiveness. "He mentioned needing to examine some documents related to the chapel trust. I've been managing the fete preparations since dawn, the tea tent, the raffle table, everywhere except near that side entrance, until after the commotion began." Geoffrey Blackwood's testimony proved particularly interesting. He claimed to have walked the village green from 10 o'clock, speaking with various residents before visiting the post office to place a telephone call to his London solicitor at 10:35. "Entirely routine business matters," he assured the inspector, though his grip on his walking stick remained notably tight. Miss Marple observed how his heavy signet ring caught the light, revealing what appeared to be a faint, chalky residue caught in the deep engraving of the Ashwood family crest. Dr. Finch and Eleanor Vance provided mutual alibis, having worked together at the bookstall since 10:30. However, Eleanor mentioned fetching a vase from the chapel porch at 10:45, placing her near the scene shortly before the discovery of the body. "I didn't enter the building," she added quickly, though her pale complexion suggested the morning's events had affected her more deeply than she cared to admit. As Constable Peters returned from verifying the telephone calls and checking the vicarage, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to several curious details others had overlooked. Near the altar steps, she noticed a trail of white granules that sparkled faintly in the slanted light. Mrs. Whitfield, following her gaze, clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Someone has been careless with the flower food," she observed, indicating a torn packet near the font. "Sugar for flowers," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "Such conveniences come in packets now. In my day, one simply used what was available." Yet, even as she spoke, her keen eyes had detected something far more significant. A thin crescent of waxy residue on Arthur's index finger, and a small droplet of hardened wax on the lectern, despite the fact that the altar candles appeared entirely unused. Peter's report confirmed Geoffrey Blackwood's telephone alibi, but revealed that the sacristy keys Arthur had borrowed remained missing. "Mrs. Whitfield says he took them yesterday and never returned them," the constable reported. "The side door lock shows no signs of forcing." This information cast the morning's events in a more sinister light. Arthur had arranged to meet someone at the chapel, someone he trusted sufficiently to admit them to the sacred space. The scattered papers from his briefcase suggested a hurried search for specific documents, while the missing keys indicated the killer had taken precautions to secure their escape route. Eleanor Vance's voice trembled as she added another crucial detail. Arthur had been researching historical records at the library recently, parish registers, property deeds, that sort of thing. He seemed increasingly troubled by discrepancies. He was finding dates and signatures that didn't align properly with official records. Miss Marple found this revelation particularly illuminating. Combined with Mrs. Clement's earlier mention of Arthur's agitation over old documents coming to light, a pattern began to emerge. The village solicitor had been conducting some form of investigation that threatened someone's current position or financial security. Geoffrey Blackwood's reaction to any mention of property matters was telling. His knuckles whitened around his walking stick, and his casual attempts to redirect suspicion toward Arthur himself suggested a man under considerable strain. "Solicitors have been known to misappropriate client funds," he remarked with studied nonchalance. "Perhaps we shouldn't assume Arthur was entirely innocent in whatever led to his death." Dr. Finch's sharp response, "That's a serious accusation against a dead man who cannot defend himself," revealed the divided loyalties already forming within the village. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple reflected on the careful timing of the crime. The killer had chosen the morning of the summer fete deliberately, when alibis would be plentiful and attention diverted by the festivities. Someone in Ashwood possessed both intimate knowledge of Arthur's investigative methods and sufficient motive to silence him permanently. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay hidden among those scattered papers and in the secrets Arthur Pendleton had been so close to exposing. Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning had begun to coalesce around Geoffrey Blackwood with what Miss Marple recognized as the dangerous efficiency of a man eager to close a case. The evidence, while circumstantial, formed a compelling narrative that satisfied both police logic and village prejudice. "Mr. Blackwood," the inspector began, consulting his notes with deliberate precision, "several witnesses have mentioned your heated disagreement with Mr. Pendleton at the King's Arms last Tuesday evening. Mrs. Hartwell has informed us that this wasn't an isolated incident. You and the deceased had been at odds for weeks regarding property matters." Blackwood's composure flickered momentarily, his knuckles whitening around his walking stick. "Arthur was making unfounded accusations about my family's historical claims to certain properties. The man had developed an unfortunate tendency toward conspiracy theories in his declining years." Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but Arthur came to our shop Thursday morning, quite agitated. He said he'd uncovered systematic discrepancies in estate records, going back generations, altered dates, forged signatures, witnesses who never existed. He seemed genuinely frightened." This revelation sent a visible tremor through the gathering. Eleanor Vance nodded in confirmation, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arthur asked me to research historical documents at the county archives. He was building a case about fraudulent inheritance claims, particularly focused on properties with ecclesiastical restrictions that had somehow been converted to private use. The implications cast Blackwood's situation in an increasingly damaging light. Here was clear motive. If Arthur had indeed uncovered evidence of historical fraud related to the Ashwood estate, it provided compelling reason for murder. Inspector Craddock's satisfaction was evident as he prepared for what appeared to be an inevitable arrest. However, Miss Marple found herself troubled by details that refused to align with this convenient narrative. She had observed the chalky residue caught in the deep engraving of Blackwood's signet ring, fine white powder that caught the morning light with suspicious consistency. A gentleman might dust his ring with French chalk to prevent hot wax from adhering when pressing a seal. Yet the altar candles remained unlit and showed no recent use. The waxy residue on Arthur's index finger, the small droplet of hardened wax on the lectern, the scattered papers someone had been sealing documents when interrupted. But the timing troubled her. Blackwood's verified telephone call at 10:35 placed him at the post office during the critical minutes, requiring extraordinary speed and precision to commit murder and return unnoticed. Dr. Finch, who had remained quietly observant throughout the questioning, now spoke with measured concern. "Inspector, while Geoffrey and Arthur certainly disagreed, I feel compelled to mention Arthur's recent consultations with me. He'd been experiencing considerable stress, sleeping poorly, and mentioned feeling watched or followed. He seemed genuinely frightened of someone. The missing sacristy keys remained significant," Constable Peters added, consulting his notebook. "No signs of forced entry, suggesting Arthur admitted his killer willingly, someone he trusted implicitly." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes had been cataloguing other details others overlooked. Near the vestry latch, she noticed a thread of fine blue wool, no longer than a fingernail. Eleanor Vance wore a blue cardigan of neat, economical knit, and when Miss Marple murmured appreciatively about "such pretty work," Eleanor flushed and tugged her cuff lower. The white granules near the altar steps, dismissed by Mrs. Whitfield as spilled flower food, seemed oddly distributed for such an explanation. The torn packet near the font appeared deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped. As Inspector Craddock moved to formally arrest Geoffrey Blackwood, Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. "Inspector, if I might make a small observation. The candlestick used as the murder weapon, it's one of a pair from the altar, yet its partner remains in place, unlit, rather curious that someone would choose such an unwieldy weapon when other options were readily available. The inspector paused, his confidence wavering slightly. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that murderers who planned carefully rarely left such convenient trails of public animosity. The obvious suspect was rarely the correct one in such intricate affairs. Inspector Craddock's hand paused mid-gesture, the formal words of arrest dying on his lips as he turned toward Miss Marple with grudging respect. Her gentle observation had introduced sufficient doubt to warrant further investigation, though his expression remained skeptical of amateur interference. "What exactly troubles you about the candlestick, Miss Marple?" he inquired, his professional courtesy barely concealing his impatience. Miss Marple approached the altar with the unhurried movements of someone examining a particularly intricate piece of needlework. Simply that someone familiar with the chapel's arrangements would know which candlestick could be removed without disturbing the altar's symmetry, she replied mildly. "This particular one has always had a loose base. I noticed it wobbling during last Sunday's service." Constable Peters, encouraged by this line of inquiry, crouched beside the murder weapon with renewed attention. "There's green residue on the base, sir. Looks like that foam they use for flower arrangements." "Floral oasis," Mrs. Whitfield confirmed sharply, though her defensive tone suggested criticism of her maintenance standards. "Someone lifted this from near the arrangements, not from the altar itself. I would never permit such desecration of sacred objects." Miss Marple knelt with surprising agility, examining the scattered white granules near the altar steps that had been dismissed as spilled flower food. She touched them delicately with a gloved fingertip, bringing them close to her nose. "Not sugar, I think," she murmured thoughtfully. "Gum sandarac, what we used to call pounce powder, essential for drying wet ink before it's smudged." Inspector Craddock frowned at this revelation, suggesting Mr. Pendleton was writing here shortly before his death. "Writing and sealing," Miss Marple confirmed gently, indicating the droplet of hardened wax embedded in the lectern's carved scrollwork. Someone who feared interruption might choose this elevated position for both light and visibility. The implication sent a ripple of unease through the gathered villagers. Arthur had been conducting official business in the chapel, using materials that required careful preparation and authentication. Yet no sealing supplies had been found among his possessions. Mrs. Whitfield's composure cracked slightly as she clutched her clipboard with white knuckles. "The chapel trust seal is kept in the vestry press under my supervision. Arthur borrowed it yesterday afternoon with proper authorization, claiming he needed to examine its impression against historical documents." "Where is it now?" Craddock demanded with renewed urgency. Constable Peters tried the small iron press and emerged empty-handed. "Not here, sir. The velvet tray is completely empty." Miss Marple had been quietly examining Arthur's scattered papers, her keen eyes noting details others overlooked. From beneath the writing case, she extracted a sheet of blotting paper, bearing the ghostly impression of a fresh seal, reversed, but unmistakably clear. An ash tree flanked by a chapel gable, the ancient symbol of the Ashwood Ecclesiastical Trust. "He sealed something quite recently," she observed with characteristic understatement. The search that followed revealed no sealed documents. But behind the flower cupboard, Peters discovered the torn corner of an envelope bearing flattened blue wax where a seal had been forcibly removed. The evidence suggested Arthur had been interrupted while authenticating important papers, possibly the corrective deed Dr. Finch had mentioned. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Eleanor Vance, whose blue cardigan showed signs of recent mending near the left cuff. The young woman had grown increasingly pale during the proceedings, her hands trembling as she helped gather the scattered documents. Her expertise in historical research, combined with her obvious distress and the blue thread caught on the vestry latch, painted a picture far more complex than village gossip suggested. "Inspector," Miss Marple suggested gently, "perhaps we might examine more closely who possessed both the knowledge to authenticate historical documents and compelling reasons to prevent Mr. Pendleton's discoveries from becoming public." As the investigation broadened beyond the obvious suspect, Miss Marple reflected that the truth, like the finest embroidery, often revealed itself through the smallest, most carefully placed details. Inspector Craddock's renewed focus on the broader circle of suspects created a palpable shift in the chapel's atmosphere. The convenient narrative of Geoffrey Blackwood's guilt was crumbling, replaced by something far more complex and disturbing. Eleanor Vance, summoned for more detailed questioning, displayed increasing distress as the inspector's inquiries grew more pointed. Miss Vance, Craddock began with measured precision. Your research assistance to Mr. Pendleton appears more significant than initially suggested. What exactly was the nature of his historical investigation? Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched her blue cardigan closer. Arthur discovered systematic irregularities in property deeds dating back to the early 19th century. Specifically, he was investigating the transfer of ecclesiastical lands that should have remained under perpetual trust to the chapel. Her voice gained strength as she continued. Properties with covenants preventing private ownership had somehow passed into individual hands through what appeared to be carefully altered documentation. Lady Ashwood's composure cracked visibly at this revelation. "Preposterous accusations against my family's legitimate holdings," she declared, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. "The Ashwood estate has maintained impeccable records for generations." Miss Marple observed the interplay of reactions with particular interest. Geoffrey Blackwood's knuckles had whitened around his walking stick, yet his expression suggested genuine shock rather than guilty knowledge. Dr. Finch moved protectively closer to Eleanor, whose expertise in historical documentation was becoming increasingly significant to the case. Constable Peters returned from a more thorough search of the vestry, carrying a leather portfolio that had been concealed behind the prayer books. "Hidden rather carefully, sir," he reported, opening it to reveal photocopied deeds, comparative handwriting samples, and meticulous notes documenting systematic document alterations spanning decades. Arthur's investigation had been far more comprehensive than anyone realized. The portfolio contained damning evidence of forged witnesses, altered dates, and signatures bearing suspicious similarities across different time periods. Most significantly, it detailed how ecclesiastical restrictions had been systematically removed from property deeds through careful manipulation of original documents. Arthur was preparing corrected versions. Eleanor whispered, her composure finally breaking. He'd discovered that the original Ashwood Chapel Trust Charter granted perpetual rights that were deliberately suppressed when lands were privatized. He was going to restore the authentic terms and present them to the church authorities this week. The implications sent a ripple of unease through the gathering. Arthur hadn't merely been investigating historical curiosities, he was actively preparing to rectify what he believed was centuries-old fraud that had enriched certain families at the expense of the church and community. Miss Marple examined the portfolio with the careful attention she might give to a complex piece of needlework. "Such thorough documentation," she murmured approvingly. Arthur was building an irrefutable case. These materials would have exposed decades of carefully concealed alterations. Dr. Finch's protective instincts flared as Eleanor's distress became more pronounced. "She's been under tremendous strain with this research. Working late hours, growing increasingly withdrawn as the implications became clear." The blue thread caught on the vestry latch. Eleanor's mended cardigan cuff, her presence near the chapel shortly before the body's discovery, evidence was accumulating with concerning consistency. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by elements that refused to align with this emerging narrative. Behind the flower arrangement, Peters discovered additional evidence. Fragments of torn parchment bearing traces of blue wax, where a seal had been forcibly removed. Someone had interrupted Arthur's authentication process, snatched the corrected documents, and eliminated the threat he represented to long-buried secrets. "The missing chapel trust seal becomes crucial," Miss Marple observed quietly. Someone with both access to the vestry and knowledge of Arthur's authentication process would have understood the significance of preventing those documents from being properly sealed, Eleanor's genuine terror seemed to stem from fear of exposure rather than guilt over murder, while her emotional attachment to Dr. Finch suggested someone seeking protection rather than concealment. The calculating nature of Arthur's murder, combined with the methodical removal of specific documents, implied an intelligence that contrasted sharply with Eleanor's obvious emotional fragility. As Inspector Craddock prepared to pursue this new line of investigation, Miss Marple reflected that in her experience, the most dangerous murderers were often those who appeared least capable of violence, individuals whose desperation drove them to acts that seemed entirely contrary to their nature. The afternoon shadows lengthened as Inspector Craddock's investigation took an inevitable turn toward the vicarage, where Arthur Pendleton had spent considerable time in recent weeks. Mrs. Whitfield's increasing agitation had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple, particularly the way her fingers worried constantly at the chain of keys hanging from her waist, and how her characteristic efficiency had given way to barely controlled distress. "We should examine the parish records," Miss Marple suggested gently to the inspector. If Arthur was researching historical documentation as thoroughly as Miss Vance indicates, he would certainly have consulted the original registers. Mrs. Whitfield's face went pale at this suggestion. "The records are kept in my husband's study safe," she managed, her voice barely steady. "Basil has gone to visit Mrs. Henderson at the cottage hospital. But of course, we should." Her words trailed off as her hand instinctively moved to her keychain, and Miss Marple noted with interest that one link appeared bent and empty. The small party made their way along the gravel path to the vicarage, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains onto polished furniture that spoke of decades of careful maintenance. Mrs. Whitfield's hand trembled as she opened the study door, revealing a scene that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The iron safe stood slightly ajar, its contents clearly disturbed, though not violently ransacked. Someone with both access and intimate knowledge of the filing system had conducted a methodical search. 2 distinct gaps on the shelves revealed where substantial volumes had been removed. The parish registers for 1807 through 1824. Mrs. Whitfield whispered, her composure finally cracking. "And the original indenture documents for the chapel trust. They've been taken." Constable Peters crouched beside the desk, examining white granules scattered across the carpet. "Same substance as at the chapel, sir," he reported to Inspector Craddock. "That pounce powder Miss Marple identified." Miss Marple approached the desk with her characteristic unhurried movements, her keen eyes cataloguing details others might overlook. A tiny flake of blue wax adhered to the green baize writing surface, and beside it lay a fragment of card bearing the ghostly impression of a seal tested and then torn away. The evidence suggested someone had been authenticating documents here as well, working with the same materials Arthur had used at the chapel. "Who, besides yourself and your husband, has access to this room?" Inspector Craddock inquired with professional precision. "Arthur, of course, when conducting his research," Mrs. Whitfield replied, her voice growing stronger as she focused on factual details. "But never alone. I was always present to supervise access to the records." She paused, examining the bent link on her keychain with apparent surprise. "Though I must confess, the safe key has been loose for several days. I kept meaning to have it properly repaired." The implications were troubling. Someone had taken advantage of that loosened key, gaining access during the morning's festivities when Mrs. Whitfield's attention was devoted to managing the fete. The theft had been carefully timed and executed by someone familiar with both the vicarage's routines and the significance of those particular documents. Dr. Finch appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless from his hurried arrival. "Mrs. Clement sent word that there had been further trouble," he said, his professional concern immediately focusing on Mrs. Whitfield's obvious distress. As he moved to check her pulse with practiced efficiency, Miss Marple observed a faint, chalky residue on his cuff and what appeared to be a barely perceptible blue smudge on his medical bag's worn leather handle. Eleanor Vance followed Dr. Finch into the study, her pale complexion and obvious anxiety making her appear almost fragile in the afternoon light. Her expertise in historical documentation had become increasingly significant to the investigation, and Miss Marple noted how protectively Dr. Finch positioned himself near her, as if shielding her from further questioning. Constable Peters returned from examining the garden, reporting bicycle tracks in the soft earth near the back gate. "Fresh within the hour, sir. Thin tires, and the gate latch was unbarred from the inside." The discovery of additional correspondence in Arthur's desk drawer revealed the true scope of his investigation. Letters bearing official letterheads from the church commissioners and county historical societies indicated that his research extended well beyond mere academic curiosity. Arthur had been preparing formal challenges to property transfers that had occurred over generations, armed with evidence of systematic alterations to ecclesiastical documents. He wasn't simply investigating historical irregularities. Inspector Craddock observed grimly. Mr. Pendleton was building a legal case that would have affected multiple families' holdings throughout the region. Miss Marple examined a sheet of blotting paper that had been pressed beneath Arthur's writing case, revealing the reversed impression of his careful handwriting. One phrase stood out with particular clarity. "If anything should happen to me, the authenticated copies are secure." The implication sent a chill through the gathered villagers. Arthur had been sufficiently concerned about his safety to arrange for the preservation of his evidence. Eleanor's reaction to this discovery was immediate and visceral. Her hands flew to her throat in obvious distress, and Dr. Finch moved quickly to support her as she swayed on her feet. "He made me promise to continue the work if necessary," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur had grown increasingly paranoid in recent weeks, convinced that someone was monitoring his activities. The pattern of evidence was becoming increasingly clear to Miss Marple. Someone with intimate knowledge of Arthur's research methods, access to both the chapel and vicarage, and sufficient desperation to commit murder had systematically eliminated the threat his discoveries represented. The missing chapel trust seal, the stolen parish registers, and the carefully timed theft all pointed to a methodical intelligence that had planned well beyond the immediate act of murder. As the investigation deepened, Miss Marple reflected on the careful psychology required for such calculated deception. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, whose positions in the community provided both opportunity and the assumption of innocence that made their crimes nearly undetectable. The implications of Arthur's precautionary note sent Inspector Craddock into immediate action, dispatching Constable Peters to verify whether any official correspondence had indeed been sent from the village. Miss Marple accompanied the small party to the post office, her pale blue eyes taking in the subtle reactions of each villager as they processed this new development. Mrs. Bell, the postmistress, consulted her ledger with the pride of someone whose records were beyond reproach. 2 registered packets yesterday at 4 o'clock precisely, she confirmed, adjusting her spectacles. 1 addressed to the diocesan registrar in Winchester, the other to a Mr. Harold Prynne, solicitor of Fulham. Mr. Pendleton was most particular about the registration fees and insisted on receipts for both. Eleanor Vance's face went ashen at this revelation, her hands trembling as she gripped Dr. Finch's arm for support. "Arthur never mentioned sending duplicates," she whispered, though her distress suggested she understood the implications perfectly. "There's more," Mrs. Bell continued, her expression growing stern. "This morning at 10:30, someone telephoned requesting both packets be recalled as sent in error. Very polite gentleman, claimed to be calling on Mr. Pendleton's behalf. I refused. Naturally, postal regulations are quite clear on such matters." Inspector Craddock leaned forward with renewed interest. "Did you recognize the voice?" The connection was poor, but the caller seemed familiar with postal procedures, knew exactly which forms would be required for recall, mentioned the registration numbers without prompting. Mrs. Bell consulted another ledger. "The call originated from the surgery telephone line. I have the exchange record here." Doctor. Finch's medical bag shifted in his grip, the leather handle showing that same blue smudge Miss Marple had noted earlier. My consulting room door remains unlocked during fete mornings, he said carefully. Any number of people might have used the telephone in my absence. Miss Marple observed the interplay of glances between the gathered villagers. Geoffrey Blackwood's knuckles had whitened around his walking stick, while Mrs. Whitfield's characteristic efficiency had given way to barely controlled agitation. Lady Ashwood maintained her imperious composure, though her sharp eyes missed nothing of the developing situation. The party returned to the chapel grounds, just as an urgent commotion erupted near the vestry. Smoke was curling from the small window, and several villagers were rushing toward the ancient building with buckets and wet sacking. Constable Peters and 2 vergers had discovered a fire in the waste bin, its contents reduced to ash and melted fragments of blue wax. "Someone's been tidying up," Peters reported grimly, examining the charred remains. "Recent burning. The metal's still warm. Papers mostly, but there's melted sealing wax mixed throughout." Miss Marple approached the scene with her characteristic unhurried movements, her keen eyes cataloguing details others might overlook. Near the scorched waste bin, she noticed something that made her pause thoughtfully. A small brass button, tarnished with age, lay partially concealed beneath the stone ledge. It bore the distinctive pattern of ecclesiastical vestments, MDR, the type used on ceremonial robes that hadn't been worn in decades. She murmured, carefully retrieving the button with her handkerchief. "Such things don't simply appear in vestry waste bins." Inspector Craddock examined the button with professional interest. "Looks Victorian. Possibly from old altar server robes or ceremonial vestments. But what's it doing here?" Mrs. Whitfield's reaction was immediate and telling. "Those old vestments were stored in the press beside the safe," she said, her voice barely steady. "They haven't been disturbed in years. We keep them for historical interest only." The search of the vestment press revealed it had indeed been thoroughly ransacked, with several garments showing signs of hasty examination. Someone had been searching for hiding places, looking for Arthur's backup documentation, with increasing desperation as the morning progressed. Dr. Finch moved closer to Eleanor, his protective instincts clearly aroused by her growing distress. Yet Miss Marple noted how his medical training showed in small details, the way he assessed Eleanor's pulse by observing rather than touching, how his eyes automatically checked for signs of shock or collapse. His concern appeared genuine, but there was something calculated in his positioning that suggested more than simple medical care. "The timing becomes crucial," Miss Marple observed quietly to Inspector Craddock. "Someone made that telephone call at 10:30, discovered the postal recall had failed, then came here to destroy evidence, all while maintaining an alibi during the fete activities." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke. "Arthur showed me his contingency plans last week. He'd grown increasingly paranoid, convinced someone was monitoring his research. He said if anything happened to him, I should look for his authenticated copies in the place where charity begins." The cryptic reference sent a ripple of speculation through the gathering. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that desperate people often revealed more than they intended when under stress. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the investigation deepened, it became increasingly clear that Arthur Pendleton's murder was merely the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to suppress historical truths that threatened someone's present security. The killer had planned methodically, but Miss Marple suspected that desperation was beginning to drive them toward increasingly reckless acts that would ultimately reveal their identity. Eleanor's cryptic reference sent Miss Marple's mind working with the methodical precision she might apply to a particularly complex piece of needlework. "Charity begins at home," she murmured thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes surveying the chapel's familiar interior. "But in ecclesiastical terms, charity begins with the collection of offerings for God's work." Her gaze settled on the ancient oak arms, chest positioned beside the font, its iron-bound construction speaking of centuries of faithful service. Inspector Craddock followed her reasoning immediately, approaching the medieval strongbox with renewed purpose. Mrs. Whitfield's reaction was immediate and telling. Her characteristic composure cracked visibly as she watched the inspector examine the arms box, her fingers worrying frantically at the chain of keys hanging from her waist. Surely Arthur wouldn't have. She began, then stopped abruptly, her face draining of color. The arms box key would have been included with the sacristy keys Arthur borrowed yesterday, Miss Marple observed gently. A man of his careful nature would certainly have considered the symbolic appropriateness of such a hiding place. Inside the ancient chest, beneath layers of accumulated coins and donation envelopes from the morning's fete, Constable Peters discovered a waterproof leather document wallet sealed with blue wax bearing the clear impression of the Chapel Trust seal. Arthur's contingency planning had been thorough indeed. The wallet contained photocopied deeds with Arthur's meticulous annotations, comparative handwriting analyses, and most significantly, a railway left luggage ticket from Starminster Station. A penciled note in Arthur's precise hand read, "Authenticated originals lodged Stoorminster Station, Locker 7. See clerk's word. Begins. If these copies are found, the originals remain secure." Inspector Craddock dispatched Constable Peters immediately to retrieve whatever Arthur had hidden at the railway station, while Miss Marple examined the documents with growing understanding. The evidence revealed systematic alterations to historical records spanning multiple generations. Properties worth thousands of pounds had been transferred from ecclesiastical trust to private ownership through carefully coordinated document forgery. Mrs. Whitfield's distress had become increasingly pronounced as each revelation unfolded. Her usual efficiency had given way to barely controlled agitation, and Miss Marple noted how her eyes kept darting toward in the vicarage with obvious anxiety. "Such thorough documentation," Miss Marple commented mildly, studying Arthur's careful annotations. He was building an irrefutable case about systematic fraud affecting the Chapel Trust. The sort of evidence that would require someone with intimate knowledge of historical records to suppress effectively. The implications were devastating. Someone had spent decades carefully altering parish registers, property deeds, and trust documents to legitimize questionable inheritance claims. Arthur's investigation threatened to expose not just historical fraud, but ongoing benefits derived from those carefully concealed alterations. Dr. Finch maintained his protective positioning near Eleanor, his medical training evident in how he assessed her growing distress without seeming to examine her directly. Yet Miss Marple observed subtle signs of strain that professional composure couldn't entirely suppress. The way his grip on his medical bag had tightened, how his eyes avoided direct contact with the damaging documents. The missing parish registers from the vicarage safe become particularly significant, Miss Marple continued, her gentle tone belying the sharp intelligence behind her observations. Someone with access to both the chapel and vicarage would have understood exactly which documents required removal to prevent Arthur's authentication process. Mrs. Whitfield's response was a profound stillness that settled over her like a shroud. Her characteristic efficiency had completely abandoned her, replaced by the trapped desperation of someone realizing their carefully constructed deceptions were crumbling. Her hand, instead of reaching for her keychain in its usual nervous gesture, clenched into a tight fist at her side. "The telephone call to the post office this morning troubles me most," Miss Marple added thoughtfully. Someone familiar with bureaucratic procedures, desperate enough to risk such a traceable action, yet sufficiently composed to maintain the deception when the postal recall failed. As Constable Peters returned from Stoorminster with Arthur's authenticated originals, confirming every detail of the conspiracy Arthur had uncovered, Mrs. Whitfield's silence became more damning than any confession. The evidence was overwhelming: decades of systematic document alteration, all requiring intimate access to parish records and ecclesiastical seals. Miss Marple reflected that, in her long experience with human nature, The most dangerous criminals were often those whose positions in the community provided both opportunity and the assumption of innocence that made their crimes nearly undetectable. The authenticated documents from Sturminster painted a devastating picture of systematic fraud spanning generations. Yet, Miss Marple found herself studying not the papers themselves, but the subtle reactions they provoked among the gathered villagers. Mrs. Whitfield's profound stillness spoke not of guilt, but of protective terror, the sort of fear that drove someone to shield another person at enormous personal cost. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, approaching the vestry table where Arthur's evidence lay scattered like pieces of a complex puzzle. "Perhaps we might honor Mr. Pendleton's careful methods by completing what he began, the authentication process he was conducting when interrupted." She gestured toward the blue wax and pounce powder that Constable Peters had recovered. Someone familiar with such procedures would understand their significance. Medical professionals, for instance, frequently employ sealing wax for specimen containers and official documentation. Dr. Finch shifted his medical bag with barely perceptible tension, the blue smudge on its worn leather handle catching the afternoon light. Miss Marple's keen observation had catalogued that mark from their first encounter, along with the chalky residue on his cuff and his protective positioning near Eleanor throughout the morning's revelations. "The timing troubles me most," Miss Marple continued with characteristic mildness. "Someone with medical training would understand precisely how long Arthur would remain conscious after the initial blow, and would know exactly when death occurred, and could calculate the narrow window available for searching documents and destroying evidence." Eleanor Vance stared at Dr. Finch with growing comprehension, her face draining of color as the implication settled over her. His protective behavior, which she had interpreted as professional concern, took on a more sinister significance when viewed through this lens. "The telephone call to the post office this morning," Miss Marple observed, her gentle tone carrying inexorable logic, "required intimate knowledge of postal regulations and bureaucratic procedures." Mrs. Bell mentioned the caller knew the registration numbers without prompting and understood exactly which forms would be required for recall. Such expertise extends naturally from medical administrative experience. Inspector Craddock's professional attention sharpened as he reassessed the morning's events. Dr. Finch's verified presence at the bookstall with Eleanor had provided mutual alibis. Yet medical emergencies regularly required doctors to leave social gatherings without attracting particular notice. "Arthur was sealing the corrected deed when you arrived at the chapel," Miss Marple said, addressing Dr. Finch directly. "He looked up and recognized you immediately. There was no surprise in his expression, was there? Only profound disappointment at realizing his trust had been betrayed." Mrs. Whitfield's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Marcus has been like a son to us since his arrival. When Arthur's investigation began threatening his family's historical claims, I couldn't bear to see another promising young man destroyed by ancient grievances." The confession revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Dr. Finch's London medical practice had been built on inherited wealth, derived from properties fraudulently obtained through the systematic document alterations Arthur had discovered. The threat of exposure hadn't just endangered his current position, it would have destroyed his entire professional foundation. "The blue wax residue on your medical bag," Miss Marple noted with characteristic understatement, "would have transferred from the chapel trust seal when you removed it from Arthur's authentication materials. Such marks are remarkably persistent on leather surfaces." Dr. Finch's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated evidence. His medical training had provided both the knowledge to commit calculated murder and the professional standing that deflected suspicion. Eleanor's genuine research expertise had unknowingly provided him with detailed intelligence about Arthur's investigation, while her obvious emotional attachment created the perfect shield for his activities. "Arthur trusted me completely," Dr. Finch said quietly, his professional demeanor dissolving into exhausted defeat. "When I entered the chapel, he was so focused on his work that he simply looked up and smiled. He had no reason to fear me until the moment I struck. The admission confirmed Miss Marple's understanding of the crime's psychology, a betrayal of trust that had made murder both possible and inevitable. Dr. Finch's admission hung in the chapel air like incense, heavy with the weight of betrayal and calculated deception. Yet Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the tension with characteristic mildness, as if discussing a particularly intricate piece of needlework that required one final, careful stitch. She said softly, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about your medical bag. In my experience, professional men often carry more than their instruments." Her pale blue eyes regarded him with the same kindly interest she might show a troubled parishioner. Dr. Finch's grip tightened on the worn leather handle, his knuckles whitening as Inspector Craddock extended an expectant hand. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse, but professional composure reasserted itself as he surrendered the bag with resigned dignity. Inside, wrapped carefully in surgical gauze, lay the missing sacristy keys with their distinctive bent ring, the small velvet tray from which the chapel trust seal had been removed, and most tellingly, a crumpled strip of dark ecclesiastical wool with 2 tarnished brass buttons intact and 1 conspicuously missing. Blue wax residue stained the gauze, while a paper twist in the side pocket contained the telltale pounce powder that had marked both crime scenes. The missing button, Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction, producing the Victorian disc she had discovered beside the scorched waste bin. It fitted the vacant thread perfectly on the woolen strip, from the old server's vestments stored in the vestry press. Mrs. Whitfield's stifled cry confirmed the identification. Her protective instincts had driven her to enable what she believed was merely document concealment, never imagining it would facilitate murder. The tears streaming down her cheeks spoke of profound guilt and shattered trust. "A sensible precaution for someone concerned about bloodstains," Miss Marple continued with characteristic understatement. "An old robe to shield modern clothes, then fire to consume the evidence. Only small things escape such careful planning." Dr. Finch's professional composure finally cracked completely, revealing the desperate calculation that had driven a healer to murder. "Arthur trusted me implicitly," he said with exhausted bitterness. "When I arrived at the chapel at 10:20, he greeted me warmly, assuming I'd come to assist with the morning's arrangements. He was so absorbed in his authentication work, so proud of finally exposing the historical fraud. The confession unfolded with clinical precision that made the betrayal even more chilling. Eleanor's research expertise had provided him with detailed intelligence about Arthur's methods and discoveries. Her unwitting reports had revealed exactly which documents posed the greatest threat to his inherited wealth, built on his great-grandfather's systematic alteration of parish records. The telephone call to the post office was desperate improvisation, he continued methodically. When Eleanor's research confirmed Arthur had dispatched authenticated copies, I hoped to prevent their delivery through official channels. Mrs. Bell's refusal forced me to proceed with destroying the local evidence. Eleanor Vance sat frozen on a nearby pew, her face ashen as she processed the scope of manipulation she had endured. Her genuine passion for historical research had been exploited by someone she trusted. Her expertise turned into weapons against the mentor who had encouraged her academic pursuits. Inspector Craddock's voice resumed its official cadence as he prepared the formal arrest. "Dr. Marcus Finch, I arrest you for the murder of Arthur Pendleton. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence." The handcuffs clicked with unseemly loudness in the sacred space, sealing the fate of the respected village physician. As Constable Peters led him away, Miss Marple reflected on the profound tragedy that had unfolded, a man dedicated to healing destroyed by the prospect of losing everything built on historical deception, while Arthur Pendleton's commitment to truth and justice had cost him his life. Mrs. Whitfield's protective loyalty had made her an unwitting accomplice, her maternal instincts toward the young doctor blinding her to the consequences of enabling document concealment. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the ancient chapel as Constable Peters led Dr. Finch away, his footsteps fading along the cobblestone path like the last notes of a funeral dirge. Miss Marple remained seated on her familiar pew, her pale blue eyes taking in the subtle shifts that murder's revelation invariably brought to a community's carefully maintained equilibrium. Inspector Craddock approached with the methodical satisfaction of a man whose case files would finally close properly. "The bicycle tracks led directly to the surgery yard," he reported quietly. "An old Humber with wax residue on the mudguard and Pounce powder in the saddlebag." He cycled to the vicarage during the raffle draw when everyone's attention was elsewhere. The timeline had crystallized with damning precision. Dr. Finch had slipped away from the bookstall at 10:15 under the pretext of fetching smelling salts for a fainting child who had never existed. His medical authority had provided perfect cover for brief absences, while his professional standing deflected suspicion from increasingly desperate acts. Eleanor Vance sat motionless nearby, her scholarly enthusiasm permanently scarred by the realization that her expertise had been systematically exploited. The historical research she had pursued with such academic passion had become the instrument of Arthur's destruction. Her innocent reports transformed into intelligence that guided a calculated murderer. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm, "you mustn't blame yourself for his deception. In my experience, the most dangerous individuals are often those who appear most worthy of our confidence. Your work will continue Arthur's mission. Truth has a way of surviving those who would suppress it." Mrs. Whitfield had collapsed onto a nearby chair, her characteristic efficiency abandoned as she confronted the consequences of her protective instincts. Her maternal concern for the young doctor had transformed her into an unwitting accomplice. Her keys and access, enabling the systematic destruction of evidence she had believed was merely embarrassing rather than murderous. Geoffrey Blackwood, freed from suspicion but visibly shaken, approached with uncharacteristic humility. "Arthur's investigation would have vindicated my family's legitimate claims," he acknowledged quietly. "His death silenced the very voice that might have restored our reputation. Perhaps it's time to complete his work properly, with full transparency." Lady Ashwood, her imperious facade finally cracked, nodded with dignity intact despite the morning's revelations. "The Chapel Trust deserves authentic stewardship," she agreed. "Arthur's dedication to historical accuracy merits that tribute, at least." As the villagers gradually dispersed, their festive mood permanently altered by tragedy's intrusion, Miss Marple reflected on the complex psychology that had driven a healer to murder. Dr. Finch's inherited wealth, built on systematic document forgery spanning generations, had provided the foundation for his medical career and social standing. The prospect of exposure hadn't merely threatened financial loss, but complete professional annihilation. The summer fêtes' abandoned decorations fluttered in the evening breeze, their cheerful colors a poignant contrast to the day's dark discoveries. Yet Miss Marple observed that even in murder's aftermath, life's essential patterns continued with quiet persistence. Children still played among the stalls, couples walked hand in hand, and the ancient rhythms of village existence reasserted themselves against tragedy's temporary disruption. Mrs. Clement joined Miss Marple as the chapel emptied, her expression troubled by the day's revelations. How does a community recover from such profound betrayal? Time and truth, Miss Marple replied with gentle wisdom, her needles continuing their methodical work. Villages have survived far worse scandals than this one. People will remember Arthur's dedication to justice and learn to trust again, though perhaps more carefully. Human nature, in all its complexity, remains as predictable as these stitches, capable of both profound deception and remarkable resilience. As the church bell chimed the evening hour, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to the vicarage, reflecting that the secret of Ashwood Chapel had been not merely about murder, but about the eternal struggle between truth and deception that played out in every human heart. 3 weeks had passed since Dr. Finch's arrest, and Miss Marple found herself once again beneath the ancient elm, her knitting needles clicking with familiar rhythm as she prepared for her departure from Ashwood. The village had begun its delicate process of healing. Like a garden recovering from an unexpected frost that had damaged but not destroyed its essential vitality. The authenticated documents Arthur Pendleton had died protecting were now safely lodged with the church commissioners, prompting a comprehensive review of ecclesiastical property transfers throughout the county. Eleanor Vance, her scholarly reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the affair, had accepted a position leading the historical commission tasked with rectifying generations of systematic fraud. Her expertise, once manipulated for murderous purposes, now served the cause of historical justice Arthur had championed. Mrs. Whitfield had resigned her position as verger, though Bishop Harrington's gentle insistence on Christian forgiveness had prevented formal charges for her unwitting assistance. She tended her cottage garden now with the same meticulous care she had once devoted to parish administration, her protective instincts channeled toward nurturing rather than enabling. The bent key link remained in her jewelry box, a small reminder of how misguided loyalty could facilitate terrible consequences. Geoffrey Blackwood's vindication had been complete. Arthur's research, establishing his family's legitimate claims beyond dispute. Yet prosperity's restoration had brought unexpected humility rather than triumph. He now served as trustee for the restored chapel fund, his business acumen dedicated to ensuring transparent stewardship of ecclesiastical properties. The bitter resentment that had marked his return to Ashwood had transformed into purposeful dedication to preventing future deceptions. Lady Ashwood, her imperious manner softened by Summer's revelations, had become an unlikely advocate for historical transparency. Her bath chair appeared regularly at parish meetings where she insisted on rigorous accountability for all trust dealings. The aristocratic authority she had once used to deflect scrutiny now served to ensure such systematic fraud could never again take root in Ashwood's carefully maintained respectability. Arthur would have been pleased, Mrs. Clement observed, settling beside Miss Marple with afternoon tea. His dedication to historical accuracy is finally receiving proper recognition. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed Eleanor's purposeful movements as she emerged from the chapel, carrying a portfolio of restored documents. The young woman had transformed initial trauma into scholarly determination, her research now serving truth rather than unwitting deception. The most satisfying aspect, Miss Marple reflected, is how Arthur's careful methods ultimately triumphed despite every attempt to suppress them. Truth, properly documented, possesses remarkable resilience. The Morning Post had brought news that Dr. Finch's trial would proceed in autumn, his confession simplifying what might otherwise have been complex prosecution. His inherited wealth, built on fraudulent property transfers, would be forfeited to restore the chapel trust's legitimate holdings. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple. His attempt to preserve ill-gotten gains had ultimately ensured their complete loss. As the church bell chimed the evening hour, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and reflected on the eternal patterns governing human behavior. Dr. Finch's medical training had provided both knowledge to commit calculated murder and professional standing that deflected suspicion, yet his very competence had ultimately betrayed him through meticulous evidence he left behind. "In my experience," she observed to Mrs. Clement as they walked toward the vicarage, "the most dangerous criminals are often those whose positions provide both opportunity and assumption of innocence. Yet their respectability becomes their downfall. They cannot resist methodical approaches that made them successful in legitimate endeavors." The village settled into evening routine with quiet satisfaction of a community that had confronted its darkest secrets and emerged stronger. Arthur Pendleton's grave bore fresh flowers from Eleanor's grateful hands, while his legacy lived on in restored historical records, preventing future deceptions. Miss Marple paused at the chapel door, taking in the peaceful scene one final time. Murder had disrupted Ashwood's equilibrium, but truth's emergence had restored something more valuable than tranquility, the authentic foundation upon which genuine community could flourish.